Good afternoon and welcome back, everybody, to another rendition of the B&H Virtual Event Space. We are joined by a man who really at this point needs absolutely no introduction, but I will anyway, in case you haven't met him. Tony Gale. Tony, what's happening? How you doing today?
I'm well. How are you?
Doing absolutely wonderful in the green room. You guys all missed it. We were talking about sweets and cakes and candy. So, having a good time doing something that I love talking about. But we're going to talk about something Tony really likes talking about: photography, specifically lighting with speedlights for portraits. So he's got a lot to share. If you have any questions, please feel free to get them in. Use the Q&A feature here on Zoom or the comment section on live stream or Facebook. Want to give a huge thank you to Sony, our sponsors of the event for today. And with that, I will get out of your way, Tony. Thanks for being here again, and we'll see you in a little bit.
Sounds good. Thank you very much. Hi, everybody. I will be going over lighting with speedlights for portraiture. I am Tony Gale. I'm a New York City-based editorial, corporate, and advertising photographer, mostly photographing people and portraits. I am an artisan of imagery, Manfredo Ambassador, ex-Red Colorati, APA National President. And as always, I want to thank Sony and B&H for having me here, because if not for them, I wouldn't be here. All right. Lighting with speedlights for portraits. As we're going to be going along, I'm a Sony artisan of imagery. So a lot of what I'm going to be talking about is how Sony cameras specifically work with Sony speedlights. Whatever camera you have, whatever speedlights you have, in general, the principles are the same. Every camera system, every speedlight system is a little different. Even with one camera system, some cameras to another camera, things might behave a little differently. So if I talk about something and your camera or your system doesn't do that, fine, but it probably does something similar. All right, so one of the questions, and I think it may have come up on our last talk, which was studio lighting. Speedlights or strobes. So speedlights, small portable flash, battery powered. For me, what counts as a speedlight is something that is designed to work in the hot shoe of your camera. So it can be used on or off camera, but it's designed to work in the hot shoe of your camera. A strobe is larger. Maybe it's battery powered. Maybe it's AC powered. Maybe it's self-contained or a pack and a head. It's bigger. It's typically more powerful, but it cannot work in the hot shoe of your camera, and it's bulkier. So as I say in every one of these, we are in an exciting time to be a photographer. I say that every time because I believe it. As an example, the Vivitar 283 there, they don't make that version anymore. I don't know if they still make a version. That was the workhorse speedlight that many of us had. It was powerful, it was great. It did one thing. You could use a little colored thristor and tell it, I'm shooting at f8 and I'm at this distance, and it would roughly get it right, or you could set it to manual. Those were your two choices. If you forgot to change that dial, your exposure was off. If you had the wrong speed film, your exposure was off. Wrong aperture, your exposure was off. All of those things, your exposure was off. What we have now are super smart speedlights that communicate with the camera. You can either tell it to go all manual, you can tell it to be TTL, you can tell it to communicate with the camera. It knows what lens you're using, it knows what ISO you're at, what f-stop, all of that. It communicates in a way that back in the day, nothing did. It makes it much, much, much easier. So the barrier to entry to getting images that at least are adequate is much lower than it used to be. And then once we get adequate pictures, we work on getting better pictures and better pictures and better pictures. Every picture ever made could be better. Every picture I've ever made could be better. If I look at a picture from 5 years ago, I almost always wish I'd done it better. Sometimes if I look at a picture from yesterday, I think of ways to make it better. But all of that is easier now because of the tools we have available to us. All right, so I talked about some of the differences, some of the pros of speedlights. They're small and portable. They typically take AA batteries. So if you forgot to charge your batteries or you forgot to bring batteries, wherever you are in the world, you can probably get AA batteries. They're relatively inexpensive compared to a big studio strobe. The fast duration is very, very fast. The flash duration is the amount of time that the flash is actually firing. So if you were in your house and you flip the light switch on, off really quick, the amount of time the light is on is your flash duration. So Speedlights, it's on a very short period of time, which is good for freezing motion. Some older strobes, especially older studio strobes, have a very long flash duration and they're not great for freezing motion. So very fast flash duration on Speedlights. Most of them can do TTL, which is automatic through the lens metering. That's based on what your camera settings are. And typically they can do high speed sync, which is a way to increase your shutter speed. We'll talk about that in a little bit. If you're trying to decide between Speedlights and strobes, some of the advantages that strobes have over Speedlights: faster recycle time, they're typically more powerful, there's typically more modifiers, they may or may not have TTL and high speed sync. That very much varies on the system. So the right one for you depends. I use them both. If I'm traveling, I often just put 2 or 3 Speedlights in my rolling camera bag because I can fit them in there. If I'm traveling for a big project, I'll either fly with strobes or I'll rent strobes. But if I'm just going somewhere to do something like I just want to hike around and explore and see what's there, Speedlights are great for that because they pack up small. All right. So one important thing that when you're thinking about Speedlights or strobes is your flash sync speed. So the flash sync speed is the fastest shutter speed you can use and still use your flash without going into high speed sync. Bearing in mind that not every flash system and not every camera system supports high speed sync. So your typical camera is going to have a sync speed of between 1/60th and 2/50th. It just depends. So most of the Sony cameras, it's 2/50th. The Alpha 1 can go up to 1/400th of a second and 1/500th in APS-C mode. But typically, with the exception of that, most cameras, 2/50th is the top. Some of them, it's even lower. If you're old school and shooting film, the Pentax 6.7 had a 1/30th of a second flash sync speed. And what that means is if you set your shutter speed faster than the sync speed and you do not have high speed sync enabled, you'll get a black bar like we have here on the right. This was with a Alpha 7.4 where the top sync speed is 2/50th. So at 3/20th, you see some of the shutter. The reason for that is that the shutter itself is not completely open at shutter speeds slower or faster than the sync speed. It exposes in a slit. It's constantly moving. And so when it flashes, part of the frame is blocked by the shutter. If you use high speed sync, it fires multiple times and does that. So I mentioned the Alpha 1, 400th of a second sync speed. A big part of why I bought this camera is because of that sync speed. The difference between a 2/50th and a 400th is only 2/3 of a stop. But if you're shooting outside and you're trying to bring down the sun, it makes a big, big difference. And then I mentioned high speed sync and HSS. There's also something called hypersync. Functionally, they're the same, even though they work a little bit differently. I'm not going to talk about them much because for portraiture, you may use them if you're outside, but inside, they're not super relevant. What they are is a way to have your flash and your camera communicate so that your shutter speed can go higher. The trade-off in doing that is that you lose a lot of power. So a lot of cameras will support a sync speed in high speed sync up to say an 8,000th of a second. You can do that, but you're going to have so little power at an 8,000th of a second that it may not be useful. It's going to depend on the system you're using and how close the flash is to your subject. So it's there, but be aware it's limited. I often find if I'm only going to go a little bit into high speed sync, it's better to just figure out a way to not do it at all because of the power loss. And then hypersync, it's the same system. It just, instead of using pulses, it uses the back end of the flash curve. Something else to think about with Speedlights is, do you want to be in TTL or manual? Most of the time when I'm using Speedlights For portraits, I'm in manual. TTL, everything's auto. It measures the light coming off of the subject, exposes correctly. That can all work great if you're shooting events and you're moving around and you're photographing somebody that's 5 feet away and then someone that's 10 feet away and then someone that's 2 feet away. TTL is the way to go because that is constantly changing. To try and do that with manual, it's going to slow you down a lot and you're going to get a lot of bad frames. TTL is perfect for that. TTL also, though, does a pre-flash. Every flash I'm aware of with TTL does a pre-flash, which is a very low-powered flash that it uses to measure the exposure before it does the full flash. So you lose just a tiny fraction of a second in timing. So let's say you want to photograph somebody jumping. If you wait, look through and hit your shutter right when they're at the peak of their jump, because of that pre-flash, there's going to be a fraction of a second before it goes, and they're just going to be a little bit lower. So you either have to time it, so you hit the shutter right before they reach there, or use manual. If I'm photographing anything not moving, anything I have control, I'm in manual 95% of the time. Where I set the power, it doesn't change. The only thing that changes is if I change it. Another thing to think about with flashes is the guide number. So with strobes, everything's in watts. With speedlights, there's a guide number, which is a ratio of the f-stop and a distance. The trick with guide number, which is similar to watts, is that you can't necessarily equate one system to another system. So if you have camera system A and camera system B, and they both have the same guide number, they may or may not be the same power speedlight. Just like with strobes, if it's a 500 watt pack or a 500 watt head, it may or may not be as bright as a different 500 watt head. Where guide number is useful is to compare the relative power within a system. So Sony has a bunch of speedlights. They just announced the HVL F60 RM2. So in that, if you're looking at Sony, the 60 is the guide number. Sony measures their guide number in meters. Some companies measure it in feet. So the 60 is their highest number. It's their most powerful flash. They also have down to the HVL F20M, guide number is 20. So 20 less powerful than 60. And then there's a whole range. I'm going to go over it a little bit more to demystify it a little. So HVL F60 RM2, for those of you who are curious, because I was, with that naming, HVL is hybrid video light, F is for flash, 60 is the guide number, R is radio, M is multi-interface shoe. The 2 is it's the version 2. They just announced this week. My pre-order is in. Should ship in 2 weeks, it looks like, I hope. They've also, same day, announced the HVL F46 RM. And then prior to that, we had the 60 RM, the 45 RM. I don't know if they're going to still have those or if they're being replaced by the 60 RM2 and the 46 RM. And then there's the 28 RM. There are other flashes, and I'll talk about those in a little. I would recommend, whether you use Sony or any other brand, don't buy any speedlights that don't have a radio built into the speedlight itself. Unless you're never going to use it off camera, you only want to buy something where the radio is part of the speedlight. So with Sony's, if it has an R before the M, there's a radio built in. If it doesn't, there isn't. So there are some of the older ones, like the 20 and the 32, that are just M. Those speedlights are fine, and they're very small. So if you just wish you had a pop-up flash, just for a little fill every now and then, you don't care about going off camera, then those flashes are great. If you are like, I want to bring a bunch of things and do all sorts of cool stuff, I would look at something with an R in it. You do have the option with older Sony speedlights, is there is a wireless radio receiver that attaches to the bottom of the speedlight, and a wireless radio commander, which I actually really like, regardless of which speedlights you have. And there are ways to take your older Sony speedlights and make them have radios. And there's also a super cool battery pack that cuts your recycle time by a lot. All right, so this is a multi-interface shoe. If you're using Sony, you have the multi-interface shoe. Whatever system you're using, there's different pin configurations. There's different ways that the camera and the flash communicate. If you've ever taken a flash from one camera and tried to put it on another camera brand and wondered why it didn't work right, it's because they all communicate differently. They all have different pin configurations. Typically, they all have a center pin. And so usually you can use any flash on any camera if you're in manual, if the flash is in manual, but TTL and things like that won't typically work. Sony with the multi-interface shoe has a bunch of other things. There's some digital mics that work really well through the hot shoe, all sorts of cool stuff. All right, so let's get down into flash control. We're just starting with the basics, and then we're going to talk about actually using them, I promise. If you're using a newer Sony camera, in your menu, you have wireless flash control. You have flash mode. So on the right is the newest Sony menu system. On the left is the second newest. I do not have the older one. So you have your flash mode. You've got fill flash, slow sync, and rear sync. So fill flash is what you're going to use most of the time. Slow sync is telling the camera that your shutter speed is going to be long and you want the flash to fire with that long shutter speed. And then rear sync is telling the flash to fire at the end of the exposure instead of the beginning of the exposure. Usually your flash will fire as soon as you hit the shutter. And then let's say you have a 2-second exposure, the flash will fire, the rest of the exposure will happen. If you set it to rear sync, your shutter will open, 2 seconds, then your flash fires. One of the use cases to do that is if you're photographing something moving, let's say you're photographing somebody running. If you use it normally, they'll be sharp and then there'll be the blur in front of them. If you do rear sync, there'll be a blur and then them where they get frozen by the flash, and it tends to feel more like what we envision speed looking like. So that's where you might be. One of the reasons to use slow sync as well is if you are in an environment that's dark and you want to shoot on aperture priority and get whatever exposure you need for that environment with some flash, you're going to want to use slow sync. I can't say this is the case with all camera or all Sony bodies, but with at least some, if you put a flash on the camera and you put it into aperture priority, it's still going to limit that shutter speed so it doesn't get too long. If you turn it to slow sync, it will allow it to get longer. You have flash compensation. Flash compensation is telling it 0 means exposed as you think it should be, just like exposure compensation on your camera. You can turn it up or down 3 stops. So often people will use a speed light on the camera as a fill flash outside. You don't want it to overwhelm the exposure, but you want it to fill in some of the shadows. You might set it to -1 or -2. Or maybe you do want it to be much brighter and set it to +1, +2, +3. A nuance with Sony cameras is if you want to use lights off camera, you have to set wireless flash to on. It's typically off by default, so you'll have to set that to on. And you do, because this is always asked, you do need a transmitter of some kind on your camera. It can be a speedlight, a radio speedlight. It can be that transmitter that I mentioned earlier, whatever it is, but you need something there to communicate from the camera to your external flashes. Wireless flash, just turn it on. I typically leave it on. And then I mentioned some of the newer cameras, the R4, the Alpha 1, the S3, have external flash control. So if you have a radio flash on your camera or the radio transmitter, you can go into your menu and adjust your settings there. So you can tell it manual TTL, high-speed sync on or off, ratio control on or off. Ratio control just tells it that you want A, B, and C to have different exposures. Group flash, all sorts of stuff. High-speed sync, I just always leave that on. You can adjust your flash power from 1:1 to 1/125 or to 1/256, depending on the flash. If you're in ratio, which in this instance would be TTL ratio, you can go from off to 16. A higher number is brighter. So if one flash is at 1 and one is at 2, the one at 2 is twice as bright. Another thing when you're using Speedlights, and this will typically happen automatically if you're using a Speedlight with a multi-interface shoe, whether it's Sony or not. If you're shooting with another camera system and it's a mirrorless camera, you're going to have something like this in your menu. I would imagine that if it's the correct flash on your camera, it will happen automatically. But if it doesn't, somewhere in your camera's menu, there's something about live view, display, setting effect, something like that. And you're going to want to turn that off. The reason being, this is live view setting effect on. This is where one of the great things about mirrorless cameras is you're looking through the viewfinder and you're seeing what that exposure is going to give you, right? You're seeing that the color's off, that it's bright, that it's dark, whatever. If you're using a flash, you're adding light to that the camera doesn't know about until it fires. So if you set your exposure to say a 2/50th of a second at 6.3, maybe everything is just black and you can't see anything. You want setting effect off. That just makes everything brighter so you can see, but it won't show you what your correct exposure is. It just makes it bright. It makes it more similar to a traditional DSLR where you're looking through the prism, through a mirror, and then just at your stuff. Again, if you're using a flash that's dedicated to your camera system, like a Sony with the multi-interface shoe, this will all happen automatically. But if you're not, it won't, and you're going to need to turn that off. All right, so then you've got your camera settings: aperture priority, shutter priority, program, manual, auto. So before I get to that, actually, one of the things is shutter speed, right? So you're using a flash, you're trying to figure out what's the right shutter speed. Within reason, your shutter speed doesn't matter. These are 9 pictures I took of myself this afternoon. Every one of them, all the settings are identical except the shutter speed. Half a second on the upper left, 1/400th of a second on the lower right. They all look the same. The reason they all look the same is because the room was dark. So there was little, if any, ambient light to affect the exposure. And so your flash, it's firing. It flashes once, whether the shutter's open for 4 days or 400th of a second, it doesn't matter. It's flashing once. One flash, that's all your exposure if the room is dark. So within reason, your shutter speed, not really relevant. Where that does matter is, let's say you're photographing outside, then your shutter speed impacts all the ambient light. If you're in a well-lit room, the ambient light. And if you go above whatever your sync speed is, then you get into high-speed sync and you lose power because of the high-speed sync. But your exposure, your shutter speed does not affect the exposure of your flash. If you're not sure and you just want a number, 1/25th of a second, 200th of a second, those are pretty safe places to start. And then, take a picture and see. All right. Also, so here we are, Alpha 1, 24105 F4G, my HVL F60RM, manual exposure on the upper right, F4, 1/100th of a second, ISO 200. Program lower left, F4, 1/60th of a second, ISO 200. Aperture priority upper right, F4, 1/60th, ISO 200. Shutter priority lower right, F4, 1/100th, ISO 200. You'll notice they all kind of look the same. And you'll notice that manuals, that's what I set it to, right? It's that exposure because I told it to do that. Program, it's picking a shutter speed and an aperture that it thinks is appropriate. Often it defaults to a 60th of a second. F4 aperture priority, because it was at F4 and I was not in slow sync, it limited it to a 60th of a second. Shutter priority, I set the shutter and it just does whatever. I set the shutter to 1/100th, it did F4. So what you're on doesn't necessarily matter so much, and these are all in TTL, to be clear. So TTL, it's giving me the same exposure regardless. There are the exceptions. So this is same thing. Aperture priority F4, 0.4 seconds at ISO with ISO 200 because I set the camera to slow sync. So if you want some of that ambient bleeding in, aperture priority, slow sync. That's probably going to vary based on your camera. And there are reasons to do that as well. So this is 2-second exposure, f4, dark room, but I'm using a little light motion light to move around and create that shape. There's a really famous picture of Picasso painting a bull with light. So this kind of thing, the reason this works, pop the flash, it freezes me, everything is dark. So once that happens, the only thing you're seeing is the light as I move it around. And because it's facing the camera, it's not lighting me. And so everything else looks sharp. This was direct flash. I felt like direct flash was a little harsh. So instead I bounced the flash, did it again. But when I did that, it caused a little bit of fuzziness because the exposure jumped around. All right, and then some other examples. This is no flash. It's a legit no flash. I didn't just put up a black screen. Direct flash, flash bouncing up. So we all start with direct flash. That's just the flash pointed right at your subject, right? It works, but it tends to be harsh. It's not very flattering. For a little while, 5-10 years ago, in fashion, there were a couple of photographers that did it all the time. But in general, it's not ideal. It gets you the most power. It's very efficient. If you're shooting events, it's probably what you're going to need to do. But you have options. So direct flash, bounce flash up. So this is the camera pointed at me. The flash, instead of being pointed right at me, is pointed up at the ceiling. So it's bouncing up. It's getting a lot softer because it's bouncing off the ceiling. It's becoming effectively a larger light source. And coming down, it's more flattering light, but it's a little top heavy. And when you do bounce flash up, you're limited by your ceiling height. So if you're somewhere with a 20-foot ceiling, it's more restrictive because it's got so much more to go, so much more distance to go. It's going to be less bright than if you have like an 8-foot ceiling. And you want to be careful when you do that, that you're not bouncing so that it's hitting the ceiling directly above your subject and giving you raccoon eyes. This is bounce flash bouncing back into the wall behind the camera. I think, so you look at this compared to this is a nicer light. It's softer. It feels a little bit like window light, just bouncing, turned around, straight back. This is bouncing onto the wall to the right. These are all white walls. This is my favorite of all. It gives a little shape. It feels like it was planned. And typically if I'm using a speedlight and I don't have a modifier, if I can, this is what I'll do, is bounce it off a wall to the left or to the right. If your wall is not white, your mileage may vary. If it's a bright red wall, it's going to do funny things to your color. If it's a dark wall, you're going to lose light. All right, so that's inside. Now we're moving outside. No flash on the terrace, my apartment in Brooklyn. That's not great light. You know, I'm all shadowy, not amazing. This is direct flash, so it's better, but it feels a little direct, right? And then I mentioned your flash compensation. So no flash, full power, -1. So this feels more natural to me. The flash is set to expose -1 in TTL. So instead of being a little overlit like here, it's just filling it a little. It feels a little more natural. You might look at this and not think it's lit at all, but when you compare it to this, you know it is. So outside, fill flash often one stop down-ish. Like anything, talk to 100 photographers, you're going to get 100 answers. There are people that will swear half a stop is right, people that will swear 2 stops is right, 1.5 stops. Whatever works for you is right for you. There isn't one right answer. But let's say I think that background's too bright. So I'm at 1/200th of a second, f5.6. Here I am, a 400th of a second, f11. Now, everything is dark out there. That's one of the great things with speedlights, with strobes in general, is that you can use the flash to bring down the ambient and get more drama. This, fine. This is more interesting because now it's moodier. It feels like it's later in the day, even though it's 2 minutes after this. You've got a little bit more control. All right. And then we're going to go back to direct flash. One of the things people like to do is play with movement. If you want to do that, you're better off with a darker background. Like I'm very close to this wall. Long exposure. It freezes things roughly, and then you get the exposure as your subject moves. This is what I think is the most interesting one. 1.3 seconds, light coming from the camera left. You can see that it's ambient light, it's tungsten light. You can see how warm that side of my face is that's pointed towards the light compared to the more neutral of the flash. Sometimes you want to photograph somebody where it's dark and bring in the background. Direct flash at 1/60th of a second, direct flash at 4 seconds. At 4 seconds, because I'm in the dark, I'm still relatively sharp. You can see a little bit of blur where the ambient light is right at the edges of my hair. It's a little blurry, you get a little ghosting. And then you can do fun things like this, 4 seconds, F4, direct flash, pop the flash, and then I just moved. Same thing here, only longer. 15 seconds, F4.5, pop the flash, and then leave. You can get this fun, just play with things, try different things. All right. And then before I start showing you examples of pictures I like, I'm going to just go through something I shot this afternoon to just show building things with Speedlights. So this is camera, Speedlight, black background, Speedlights right at me, one Speedlight, not very exciting. So look at that, it's flat. So now I have the Speedlight on the camera. I added a second Speedlight to camera left on a stand, both HVL F60 RMs. So now camera on the flash on the camera, Speedlight on the camera, Speedlight to camera left. I've used the ratio, I'm in TTL still, use the ratio to make the one on the left 2 stops brighter. So the one on the front is filling. That's why there's it's not super dark on my left side, our right, but you can see some direction to the light, right? It's a little more interesting. This is very flat. This feels a little more nuanced. But now I want some separation. So I added a third light, the HVL F28 RM, directly behind the camera, pointed towards me to get that halo. Obviously too bright, and you can see there's some dust in the room. Look at that. It's amazing how much you can see dust when it's backlit. So much too bright, turned it down 2 stops. Now it's separating me from the background. I feel like the Speedlight is still too harsh. So, and it flattened around a little with the light bouncing around. So I upped the contrast here. But if you look at the right side of my face, you can, like, there's the shadow on my eye. It still feels harsh. You can see the shadow from the Speedlight across my shoulder. So what I did is added an umbrella. Speedlights can use lots and lots of modifiers. If you've been watching most of these lighting demos we've been talking about, the first modifier everyone should get is probably a reflector, but after a reflector, an umbrella. So now I've just put a Speedlight in an umbrella. The light's much better. We've got some fill light from the one on the front. We've got the directional light from the left with the umbrella. It's a softer, more flattering light. We've got the rim light. It's a more interesting picture than this. All right. Now we're going to use some examples of people that aren't neat. That'll be more interesting. I shot this last week. A dancer out on the street in Manhattan. No Speedlight on the left, no flash on the right, Speedlight, and I'm at a 50th of a second. So because it's a little bit long, you can see her hair is blowing in the wind a little, and it's a little wispy and blurry. That can be a really cool effect. Is it right for you? I can't say. But it's a fun thing to try. You can see on her shoulders too, that just where the Speedlight froze, everything's facing us, but because there's that ambient light bleeding through on the sides, it's a little bit of ghosting on the edges. Speedlight off camera, So one thing, if you're photographing somebody close, if you have a transmitter on your camera and a speed light, is I will just hold the speed light in my hand and just shoot, which is what I did here. This is what it looked like without. So I could have exposed this so that she's properly lit, but then the daylight stuff in back would have gotten very bright. By using a speed light, it helps separate her while still getting a sense of place. No light on the left, speed light on the right. These are all in manual. We have, especially on a cloudy day, it's a nice flat, even lighting, but you still get the raccoon eyes. So adding some direction with a speed light is really useful. To do this, I actually just bungee corded a speed light to a street sign post. Just wrapped it around, put it up. And then this is direct on, the speed lights to the left, and then just move around, try different things. And this is what it looks like with no speed light. And then speed light. No speed light, speed light. No speed light on the left, speed light on the right. You can see like the light on the left is fine, but he really pops. I mean, it's also a tighter crop, but he really pops more on the right. It's more about him. There's still a sense of place. You can still tell, you know, he's somewhere. It's a little more interesting. We also have things like this. This is an old barn upstate. So I have my model here. And I have a single speed light on the left on a stand. Just single light pointed right at her. Nice and direct. There are times when that hard light coming from the side looks cool. I really like this. But I also tried one with an umbrella. You can see the umbrella reflected in the light. When you're trying to figure out how something, or you can see the umbrella reflected in the sunglasses rather. When you're trying to figure out how something was lit, just look at the eyes or anything reflective. No speed lights, speed light. So here, there's a speed light hiding behind the tree on the left. And then there's another speed light just doing a tiny bit of edge light in the back. One of the big advantages of speed lights, again, is that they're so small, you can hide them in lots of places. That can be hard to do with a larger light, but with a speed light, you can hide it behind a glass on the table. We got some nice backlighting. Everything looks great. If I try and make her bright enough that she's correctly exposed, everything in the back goes very bright. So just add a little light to the front. You can see the light stand leg there. It's just down in Lower Manhattan, off Broadway. Speed light on the left on a pole. Speed light on the left in the back on a pole. Speed light on the right pointed at him. These both have the Last Light Easy Box Speed Light 2, which is a small modifier that clamps to your speed light and makes it a little bit of a softer light source. I like them a lot. Balancing your speed light to the daylight when your subject is in shadow, but there's direct daylight in the background gives you a nice dramatic effect. Easy Box Speed Light 2 again. So here, you can see that. You can see the direction of light. And here you can see it. If you look on the upper right in front of that water tower, you can see there's a magic arm with a speed light and an Easy Box Speed Light 2 just clamped in there. One of the great things with speed lights, again, they're small and they're light. So a lot of times that's how we'll rig things. Instead of putting them on light stands, I'll just clamp them to things. That's hard to do with an 8-pound light. And then this one, which you've seen before, you can see there's a light on the right, a light on the left, clamped to the railing, and then there's a third light down the stairs pointed back up. So you can see that edge light on the right, the main light on the left, and there's a tiny bit of light coming from the bottom left. Light on the left, on the back, coming in as a rim light. You can see the edge light on the left side of his face and on his sweater. And on the right, another I believe it was a Speedlight, EasyBox Speedlight 2. This is what it looks like with no Speedlight. Oh yeah, you can see it. So there's Speedlight on the left, Speedlight on the right. Speedlight on the right, and then sometimes adding a little so that you get that rim light. If you look here, you know, it's fine, but he gets a little lost on the left against the background. Here, I may have made it a little bit too bright, but it helps separate. Don't be afraid to use more lights in here. It's better exposed. Same thing, you can see it here. Speedlight on the left. You can see it way up there. And you can see it's pretty far away. A speedlight, if you're photographing someone in shadow, really can do a lot. You may have to put the power up a lot, but they can be quite powerful. Williamsburg Bridge. No light on the left, light on the right. There you can see it. One thing I also like with Speedlights with a small modifier is that it softens the light, but I like the fall off. You can see that his face is correctly exposed, and then the rest of him gets darker. No light, light. A little bit of light coming in from the right. There's also fun things. So we talked about the long exposure earlier with moving around. Another fun thing to just play with is if you're using a zoom lens, if you zoom while you're shooting, you can get this fun motion effect. With this, I at least have to do a lot of frames to find something I like, because most of them, in my experience, are either not blurry enough or too blurry, or they're blurry in the wrong way. You have to make sure that your subject's in the right place, but they're really fun. All right, I went faster, I went fast. Let's see if there are any questions.
Tony, I think that's the fastest you ever finished.
I'm always afraid that I'm going to go too slow and go long, so I try and go fast, and then I could have gone a couple minutes slower. It would have been fine.
I like it. It's that New York minute. So today we've been talking a lot about light. We've had a lot of light going on, and you know, I asked this question earlier on, and I think everybody's got sort of their own unique view on things, and so we'll get your take on this. You know, when you're out and about, you're photographing, let's say, action, things like that. You know, nailing that shot, a lot of the time you're out on a shoot, you don't have time to, you know, start playing around. You know, obviously you set all these slides up for everybody so you can demonstrate, and, you know, you took your time with it, which is great and very helpful for us. But when you're out with a client, you know, they don't have that time. They want to get the shot, they want to get out of there, they need to go, you need to go, you want to get paid. You know, what's the trick? What's the way you've learned to kind of nail that exposure, especially with flash every single time? What's your, you know, trick?
Light meter.
People. There it is.
A light meter is the secret trick. A light meter will make everything better. It will make your life better. Even though, like when I've taught college students, it's like pulling teeth to get them to use a light meter. When they finally do, it will make everything easier. It's a lot faster to meter than it is to set it up, take a picture, adjust, take a picture, adjust, take a picture, adjust, take a picture, adjust. And that's if you're just using one light. Once you start using multiple lights, it gets a lot more complicated if you're not using a meter, because you've got to get the first light right, and then the second light, maybe it's too bright, and then you want to go down, but you went too far, and then you got to go back up. And if you just meter, if you know my main light's f8, I want a subtle rim light, maybe it's 5.6, much faster with a meter.
I think Tony's secretly been watching all of our past events, so you could just plug those quietly for us, because we did have an excellent, you know, event. I think it was last week, talking about meters, and I think that's a great point. Having a light meter and not relying on your built-in camera meter is definitely, especially when it comes to lighting, is going to be huge. It's going to be a game changer.
I mean, you can sort of use your built-in camera meter with a mirrorless camera if you're using constant lights, because you can at least see what it's doing. But there's no way to see what a flash is doing until you trigger it, until you fire it. So you can set up all these things, trigger it, and then it's just a mess. And trying to figure out in what way it's a mess can take forever. But if you just meter it, do one thing at a time and meter it, it'll save you a huge amount of time.
Cool. So you mentioned in the beginning, well, not in the beginning, you mentioned later on, we were talking a little bit about modifiers, and you said that, first thing to get is a reflector. That would
Yes.
be kind of, your starting point. But I want to pose this scenario to you, Tony. You're on an island. All you have left with you is a camera, a cheesecake, and one modifier left to your name that you have to use for every shoot for the rest of your life going forward. What's that going to be for you?
Do I have lights or just the modifier?
You've got light, yeah. Well, for all intents and purposes, we'll stick to speedlights for this because we stuck solely to speedlights for this. But for a speedlight, what would your modifier of choice be?
Where's this island? Is it tropical? Is it sunny?
Oh, you're asking a lot of questions here, Tony. We'll say, you pick. We'll let you pick both. It could be tropical and sunny, and then it could also be, very Alaska-esque.
Maybe I'll go with the Easy Box Speedlight too, because it's small, it doesn't use you don't lose too much power, but it's large enough that it softens the light. For most people, I would still start with an umbrella just because it does more things. It's also like, if I'm on this island, is there someone to photograph, or is it like, what am I photographing?
It's just gonna be the animals. It's all the animals on the island. You're stranded. You're by yourself.
So if it's the animals, I'm probably not even going to use a modifier. I'll just right at it.
Just blast them full force.
Do I have a solar panel and a computer so I can at least do something with the pictures?
We'll get you some Wi-Fi connection.
All right.
I'll come visit the island every so often, but you've got to stay there. You've been sequestered to the island, Tony.
Well, actions have consequences, I guess, right?
So Lorianne's got a question for you that's maybe a little bit more on brand than my questions here. If you were recommending a light meter brand wise, what brand would you recommend for it? If you've never used a light meter in your life?
So I don't know that it's the brand that's going to matter so much as what level of light meter. It depends on what your needs are. So I have two light meters. I have a Gaussian and I have a Cyconic. Both of mine have a built-in spot meter. The Cyconic can measure flash duration. Like, they're both very, very high-end meters. To be honest, most people don't need that. If there's a meter, I don't know. There's probably meters in the $200 range, I'm guessing. Probably. Something like that is fine. You just want something simple. It should be digital. Don't buy a meter that's not digital. It should have something. So there's a white dome on meters. Typically, you want something where the white dome can be removed if necessary, because the white dome measures the light falling onto the meter. And if you take it off, it measures the light bouncing off of things. So it's the difference between an incident light meter and a reflected light meter. And you want a meter that can do both. The meter in your camera is a reflected light meter. And those are great, but they're affected by the color of something. So if you're photographing a white wall or a black wall, and metering off of that, it gets thrown off because it doesn't know. An incident light meter measures the light falling onto the meter, so it tends to be more accurate. But just a simple digital meter, probably, I'm guessing in the $200 range. I do not know. Just start with one of those.
Yeah, I mean, we've got them. We sell them here at B&H. Or not here at B&H, but in the physical store of B&H. We do have them on the website also. If you're in the virtual realm, you could definitely get them. And if you stop by the store, I'm sure we've got a bunch of them on display. Speaking about light meters and talking about digital and things like that, have you ever tried out and have an opinion on some of the stuff that actually plugs into your phone?
So the meters that plug into your phone, there are color meters that will do that are interesting. It may exist, but I'm unaware of a meter that plugs into your phone that will work with flash. It may exist. Just because I'm aware of it not aware of it doesn't mean anything. I will say that I was having a conversation with someone recently about flash duration, and they had used an app that measures flash duration. And in my opinion, that app was way off.
Okay.
So be careful. Like, the app technology is amazing. The better metering apps have to sell you something that plugs into your phone rather than just using what's on your phone. Whether it's a dome that goes over the camera on the back or whatever. So those exist. If that's, if you were like, yeah, I'd rather spend $10 and see if it works for me, go for it. I think a dedicated meter is going to be more accurate and serve you better. But different people have different needs and different uses.
There you go. Different strokes for different folks. I like it. We'll leave it there.
Indeed.
We'll leave it there. Tony, I want to thank you again for being here and talking about lighting, speed lights, demystifying all that stuff that, people get really nervous about, myself included. I always get so nervous when we're talking flash. Like, oh no, there's numbers, there's fractions, there's mathematics involved.
All you have to remember is the number double or half.
There you go. I'm gonna write that down.
Yeah. Do you have f-stops down?
Yeah.
Those are worse.
That I've got. That I've mastered.
Every other number doubles. It's weird. Flash power is way more straightforward.
So we can expect to see you back here. When are you back here again, Tony? What is it? November
10th is the
3rd.
photo walk. I think
November 3rd. November 3rd. So that's next week. Right?
Yeah.
We're in November already.
For
so
basics, part 1, flashes and lenses and cameras, I believe.
That's it. Bingo. We're gonna
there it is.
Cameras
and lenses.
There you go. We're starting off cameras and lenses. If you haven't picked out a camera yet or a lens yet, or you want to know more about them, be here next Wednesday.
We'll talk about why some things are cheaper and some things are more expensive. And
there you go. And maybe by then we'll figure out what island Tony's going to be on.
I hope it's a nice one. Hopefully it's not too small.
It's going to be beautiful. It's going to be the best island you ever been to, Tony.
Excellent. Great.
Awesome. Well, Tony, thanks again for being here. As always, you're a resident here, and you're really valuable to us, and we appreciate everything you do for us here at B&H. And we really appreciate our sponsor, Sony, for setting it up as always with Tony. They go above and beyond to bring him to us, and so we appreciate that as well. And to our valuable viewers, shoppers, people who just like to hang out and hear these ridiculous questions of what island Tony's going to be on, we appreciate you too. Because without you, we couldn't do this.
If you have a suggestion for the island,
there you go. Tony's giving you his information. Send him a message, let him know, and we'll throw those suggestions out. We'll see if we can make that happen. Maybe we can, scrounge up a GoFundMe for it. But this has been another edition of the B&H Virtual Event Space. Have a great night, everybody. We'll catch you next time.